Thanks, Mark. Just quick check. Can you see the slides okay? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yep. So I'm Neville. Mark and I have had a relatively long association from a work perspective. A few years ago now, we started working more closely and more particularly looking about how we could improve the service for the employees at the companies we both work for. Since then, we've both moved on, but we've continued to collaborate on and think through what we think is best practice from what we call experience management. So we're going to talk you through that today. Okay, so a bit more about us. So I've got about 25 years in technology. I've fulfilled most traditional IT disciplines, from operations to service management to program management to technology delivery. I'm currently a senior consultant at Cloud Stratex. And just a couple of things about me. I'm a big continuous improvement evangelist, and I like to measure progress, as objectively as we can. So I like to move the needle when it comes to service.
Okay, and I'm Mark Bewick. Thank you for having us today. Similar amount of years in technology to Neville, 25 years or so. My background is mostly in processes. I was the incident and problem management process owner and manager for a large organization. Moved into continual service improvement roles, and then, as Neville quite rightly said, for the last 3 or 4 years, Neville and I have been spending a lot of time improving employee experience in a former employer. Couple of bits about me. I love challenging the status quo and making things better, like simpler approaches to things, and I love knowledge sharing. So I love coming to these types of sessions and other industry events to share what we know. I just went on mute, sorry about that. So a couple of definitions here, and these are not vastly different to some of the stuff we've heard earlier from Duncan and co. From our perspective, employee experience is the employee's feelings and emotions during all touch points with an employer. Traditionally, we kind of think about IT and IT only, but it's much more than that, which we'll come on to a bit later. It's important, and again, it's been covered by some of the other speakers, that employees are happy and they're productive, because if they're not, they'll leave. So you improve loyalty levels if they're happy with what's going on in the workplace, every interaction with the employer, and that ultimately leads to happier customers. There's been some very famous lines on that from people like Richard Branson, for example. Look after your employees and now look after your customers, I think was something like that in the line that he said. And what is experience management then? So that for us is the continuous improvement practice, using feedback to identify opportunities for improvement, and frankly, actioning that feedback as well is really important, as we'll come on to a bit later. But it is cumulative. So I like to think of this as sort of building a wall. Every positive experience builds the wall up. Every negative one takes a brick away. So you'll see that it's important across all of the areas of the enterprise service management, which Neville will talk about a bit later. But the goal is an important one, is to provide a seamless, frictionless and holistic employee experience across the employment life cycle, allowing the employee to be happy and productive. And Neville and I will talk briefly about the different stages and how these things take place. So Neville, if we can move on, please. The first phase from the model we've put together here is pre-joining. So we've all had experience of looking for a role, looking for a job with companies, and from our perspective, the organization should want to show themselves in the best possible light, almost considering future employees as they would a customer. And you want that because you need to bring the best people to your organization. So from our perspective, at this point, communication is key. It's really important that that you know what that process is and expectations are met from the potential employee. So one takeaway that potential employers could do here is to take that journey, go through that journey as if you're a prospective employee of your company, and see how it feels. You might be surprised when you do that. Next slide, please, Neville. Next part of that journey is the joining part. Now, this isn't just, again, it isn't just IT here. You can see some of the typical activities below. This is where you onboard an employee. And to do that, it's not just giving someone a laptop and saying, off you go. It really is a matter of working through HR, IT, facilities, hiring manager, security. All of the things you need to do to bring an employee on board covers many different groups in your organization. And those groups have to have really tightly integrated process in place to make that a successful process, and to make the employee feel that they've joined an organization they want to continue working for. Then the middle bit. So consider the pre-joining, joining, and leaving bit, the sort of bread on a sandwich. The middle bit, this is where the enjoying part, as we call it, this is the point where employees learn and perform their role. And typically we focus on, again, the IT bit very heavily. We've talked about that quite a bit today. You know, the SLAs, the KPIs are a traditional way of measuring things. But frankly, it's every interaction you have with an employee has to be a good one, and it all has to be measured. You have to look across the enterprise. So how did it feel when I tried to submit my expenses claim? How did it feel when I tried to order a laptop or mobile phone, or tried to get a business visa or travel or whatever it might be? All of those interactions with an employer have to be measured to ensure that you know where there are problems and what to fix. And finally, leaving. Obviously, loads of reasons why people leave organizations, but from our view, it has to be a good experience from both the employee and the organization. You might want to encourage them back later on in their career. So you have to make sure that this is a good, seamless process that works. That again, here, I think like the pre-joining bit, communication is key. You need to know what's going to happen when you leave. You know, when are you going to get your last pay slip? When are you going to get paid? What happens to your benefits? How do you return your laptop or your phone or whatever it might be? So again, the takeaway here is, like the pre-joining, walk that journey. Pretend you're leaving the company and go through that experience as if you were in that situation, and see how it feels. You will definitely pick up points along that way as to what can be improved. Okay. So we will come into a lot of practical stuff in this session as it bounces between Neville and I. This is the first part of what we think is the way to make things better. You've seen many things like this, no doubt, in the past. Plan, do, check, act, and things like that are all very similar. It's a cyclical, continuous process to make things better. And the first thing you need to do is understand where you are, know your baseline. So if you're going on an improvement plan to improve IT support, then you need to measure what IT support looks like today. You need to know where you want to be. And a lot of this has to link to the organization's goals and objectives. Make the employee experience part of that, so it supports that organization's vision. So you want to retain people, right? So you have to find a way of making sure that where you're going to encourages that to happen. And knowing how when you get there is also important. So we talked about SLAs, KPIs earlier. We heard about the XLA briefly mentioned. You have to establish these measurements in order to know where you are. And we believe it's not just a matter of SLAs or XLAs or KPIs. It's a combination of the lot. And Neville and I have been through this a lot in our previous role about, do we scrap them? No, we nearly did. But you know, the XLA we brought in was key to improving the employee happiness. So you need a combination of service level agreements, key performance indicators, and experience level agreements to really move the needle on happiness. And finally, take an action. You have to take action. So if you're gonna try and get from A to B, you need to know and understand when you've got there. You need to know what steps you're going to take to get there. And from our perspective, we're big advocates of acting quickly. So iteratively moving, making changes as quickly as you can, and then continually measuring to make sure you know the effect of that change. So like it says at the bottom, never stop seeking improvements. You must keep going around this cycle. I don't think it ever ends. From our perspective, we moved sort of net promoter scores, which we'll talk about a bit later, from sort of 30 to late 80s into the 90s, but we never stopped looking for improvements, because you know that doesn't help. I'll hand over to Neville now for a few slides before we come back to some more practical stuff at the end.
Thank you, Mark. So as we've been discussing and thinking about employee experience, we identified what we call the employee experience elements. So these are areas you can look at, or lenses you can look through to assess where you are on your employee experience journey, and also, you know, think about where you need to get to get to your goals. So we've identified 4 elements, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. The point is with these, you know, they're not that we've shown them as linked, and they're really linked because if you make an improvement in one area, you're likely to see an improvement in the others, but they don't have to be linked. You could start by saying, right, service stability is our biggest concern at the moment. Let's focus on that, and then look at the others later. Or you could say that service is quite stable. We'll look at enterprise service management, for example. And again, the point is, if you are changing something, it will make a difference in the others, and how you change it, which I'll come on to in a second, again, can apply to all of them. And again, from a takeaway point of view, what you look at first really depends on where you are and what you want to get to. So back to what Mark talked about a second ago around understanding where you are, linking your outcomes to your business goals, and then working forward from there. Okay, so we've just got a couple of slides briefly outlining the 4 elements. So the first one on the left here is feedback. So from our point of view, you have to get feedback and then act on it. That is what experience management is. So we've used a stair analogy here. So at the bottom, you're not requesting any feedback. You're going through what we'd consider a traditional survey approach. That could be a ticket-based CSAT, and perhaps supplemented with an annual employee survey or an annual survey. What do you think about your IT? Right the way up to experience management, and then ultimately XLAs. So, we feel if you're using experience management and you're using that to support an XLA-based approach, that's best practice from our perspective. Service stability, that's fairly obvious. I think we've defined some stages there. You're moving from a chaotic, which is every day's an adventure. Users will be, or employees will be finding different ways to get help because it's not consistent, through to a more reactive, which might be where you've got 3 or 4 service management processes reasonably mature, but there's still quite a lot of disruption, through to stability, right the way through to maturity. And then the final 2, so these are quite similar in terms of how to talk through them. So digitalization. So again, we've heard quite a lot about that in different terms. So this is about how you're providing a service to your employees through digital means, and that could be through automated, could be through a portal, could be all of those. So we're going from a sporadic type approach where you might have odd pockets of good stuff, through to inconsistent, where you might have one group, say IT or HR or facilities, doing it quite well, through to a shift left and automation strategy where you're looking at that more broadly, right up to a holistic approach. So this would be where you have best practices defined and you're using those across the employee experience, so across the enterprise, rather than just looking at one particular vertical like IT. And then ESM, again very similar. So we've talked about this a lot. It's not just IT. So you've got to think about, are there pockets of good practice in other areas of your organization and not just IT? So for example, do HR have a best-in-class service desk? If they do, great, talk to them, work out what you can do together, and then look to expand that across the enterprise. Okay, so Mark's already talked about, we're fundamentally believers about taking action and making things better and doing it continuously. So experience management is about taking feedback from employees and then making changes for the better. So there's a few ways you can take feedback. We've already talked a bit about transactional, as of some of the other speakers. So when you've completed a transaction, whether that's asking for help on something or fulfilling a service request or fixing something, ask for feedback. And Mark will talk about the best practices to get feedback a bit later. Periodic surveys are also really important. So a good example of this might be sending people surveys about how they feel about a particular type of service, whether that's, what do I think about my laptop or my corporate mobile, or how do I find use of Office 365, for example. And what you do with periodic surveys, you would send regular surveys to your entire organization, but break the organization down into chunks. So for example, you might divide your organization by 360 days or something like that, and send a survey to a portion of those every single day. And there you're getting regular feedback on that. And it's proactive surveying. You're not feedbacking on something broken. You're generally asking them how do they feel about it. And that can really be valuable to get insights. Focus groups. perhaps an old-fashioned concept, but again, it's good practice to sit down with your employees on a regular basis and ask them how they feel. And co-locations, this is something Mark did particularly well in a former role, was seat support teams that are dealing with a specific business area in the same location as the business. So you're picking up feedback on a regular basis, on an ad hoc basis. And then use the feedback. So obvious, but really important. And a general rule of thumb when you're asking for feedback is don't ask for feedback if you're not going to do anything with it, because that's just going to demotivate the people that are giving you that feedback. So depending on how much volume of feedback you're getting determines how often you should review. We would recommend reviewing at least twice a week. If you're in a large organization, which we were previously, we used to do it daily, particularly while service was in a less than stable environment. And then make changes. So again, Mark talked about this before. So speed is important, but weigh that up against the risk and the amount of change your organization can tolerate. But again, we prefer rapid change. Start, change quickly, survey, and then you'll know whether it's making a difference or not. And then communicate, really important. Go back to those employees, go back to your business and say, this is what we've heard, this is what we're doing about it, and then go back later and tell them, has it got better? Again, you should be able to show that through the feedback and the data and the insights you're getting from there. So again, really important, take action quickly, even if it's small, and iterate. All right, so we're now going to talk about some best practices. So we always think it's important at these events to give people something they can take away and implement tomorrow or later on today or next week to make sure it's not all about theory. So I'm not going to talk through this in detail because we're time challenged, but Mark's already touched on this. We like Net Promoter Score as our preferred measure. You can see on the screen how you calculate that if you don't know. We like it because it moves quickly when things change and because it drives higher level of performance. And that's primarily because the passives are ignored in the calculation. So when you're driving your service providers, you're looking for that 9 or 10 to really move the needle. Okay, so Mark earlier talked about how important the new joiner experience is. So we've got a few thoughts here in terms of what we've done previously that's worked. So like Mark said, it's an early opportunity to show the employee that you care. So get it right first time and you're on your way to a happy employee. So where you can and where you've got the resource or the budget, a white glove service can really make a difference. So assign an individual to make sure that onboarding process works for that new employee. And then we've got some other best practices here. So it's obvious, but make sure mobile phones, laptops, whatever it is, are available straight away on their first day and that they work. So we recommend where you can give a new device to an employee because that makes them feel better. It's not a great experience if you're given a second-hand machine when you start a company. If you've got issues with fulfillment, consider stockpiling in main locations or hubs. Make sure it works. Sounds obvious, but again, make sure it's built and tested, and make sure it's where the employee is going to be on their first day, whether that's delivered to home if they're a home worker, or at something like a tech bar, or an IT hub or whatever, so they can collect it straight away. And again, make sure the services are provided. Make sure they're installed, tested, and they work. Make sure they've got the tools they need to provide their role. It could be a specific application like order to cash, as mentioned on the previous presentation. And make sure help is available on the first day. So again, if you can, face-to-face contact, if not a phone call or schedule a session with a tech bar, and provide us a starter pack. So this is where you go to get help. Here's the mandatory e-learning you've got to do, etc. And then get feedback. So we would recommend designing a specific survey that asks the hiring manager and the employee maybe a week after they've joined the company, how did it go? And again, simple scale NPS type measure. And again, key takeaway that it will make your employees feel good about your company if you get this right on day one. So changing direction a little bit, incidents. So we're strong advocates to put processes in place, practices in place to reduce the number of incidents that your employees are suffering. Why? Employees just want things to work, right? They don't want day-to-day disruptions for their jobs. And employers don't like incidents, right? It costs money to fix them from a support point of view, and opportunity cost in terms of lost productivity for those employees that are not able to fulfill their role. So what should you do? So we really like setting big targets. So if you set a 10% reduction, you might hit 10%, you might hit 12%. But if you set a target of 80%, you might hit 30%. And while it might look bad if you miss that target, actually you've moved the needle much more for your employees and enhance the employee experience. So how do you do that? Analyze, obvious really, look at the data and see what is it. You can, someone like ServiceNow can run a cluster analysis for you, or you can just analyze the data yourself, get support or input from your support teams, and then ask again. It goes back to the focus group type approach or the co-location type approach. Ask employees, what are the biggest issues? And then again, communication, as we've talked about before, agree what you're going to fix, communicate, and then deliver that iteratively. And again, the takeaway for this with incidents is it's easy to fix things quickly, but stopping them happening again is more important because employees just want things to work. And then escalation. So this is one of my pet topics. You're always going to need an escalation process in our view. Tickets always need to be escalated, or items always need to be escalated. And users want an effective medium to either fix an issue quickly or fulfill quickly. And again, fulfill quickly might be that you might have a 2-day SLA for a particular type, but it may be the business need on that particular day needs it delivered now. And therefore having an effective escalation process will allow you to expedite that request. And escalations are also can be quite noisy in the system for service providers. So, people often escalate to C-level executives or to their direct reports, and all of that creates noise because those escalations cascade down through hierarchies through to service providers. So some thoughts on best practice: make the process easily accessible, clear and transparent for your employees. Put it front and center on your pages or on your tools. If you want to escalate your ticket, click here. Treat expedites and escalations the same. I mentioned that earlier. Just because you've got an SLA for something doesn't mean you shouldn't consider fixing things quicker. Have a dedicated escalation team. That can really make a difference because they're focused on that all the time. Review the data and get insights from the data on a regular basis. Understand why things are being escalated and can you eradicate the need for that. And make sure your support functions are collaborating. You can do that through technology, like set up a Microsoft Teams escalation group, have key members from each of your providers on there and have the escalation team manage all those interfaces through that. And then reporting, what are you going to do with this data? So look at incidents, but also look at requests, because sometimes requests can turn into escalations. Trigger escalations automatically to define whatever scenarios work best for your company. Bouncing tickets is an obvious one. Set a threshold. How many bounces do you feel is inappropriate? Mark will talk about bouncing tickets in a second. And correlate that with your NPS. So look for where your employee experience feedback is giving you a less than favorable score, and see whether that correlates with the types of things that get escalated. And then make sure you're holding your service providers to account, both internally and externally providers. Put it in your service level agreements. Make sure you're reviewing their performance on escalations regularly. And escalations are going to happen. That's the takeaway, right? So to make sure you've got a process in place that will work to address them.
Okay, thanks, Neville. Okay, so Neville mentioned bouncing, and Neville and I spent a lot of time looking at bounce tickets and dealing with escalations from them. So this is a real life problem for many organizations. Why do we do it? Well, every time a ticket bounces between different support groups, that employee happiness reduces. And I think there's some numbers out there. Happy Signals was talked about earlier. I think they state 10 NPS points on every bounce. So it's really important, not just from a scoring perspective, but making sure the employee is happy, right? That's the outcome you're after, that they're productive, that the things get resolved as quickly as possible. And as Neville said, escalations happen on bounce tickets if they go on too long. So probably bound to time, really. Okay. So in terms of what we think is best practice is definitely measure it. It'd be surprising how many people are not measuring bounce tickets. And make it all clear to all service providers that you're doing so, and it's important that this doesn't happen. In the past, we've seen some horrific bouncing tickets, sort of 30+ ping pongs between groups. It's crazy. Monitor it. as Neville said, setting up thresholds and automatically escalating when that threshold's met is a good idea. It might be 5 bounces, it might be 10, or whatever your numbers look like when you do the analysis. Lots of tools tell you how many times a ticket's been reassigned. Very easy to see nowadays. Analyze the ticket journeys to find the root cause. So is there a specific request type that keeps bouncing? Is there a specific type of incident that keeps bouncing? Is it a specific group involved that I'm bouncing tickets? And again, some of these surveying tools can help identify this very, very simply. And then improve, fix the root cause of that. Identify where the problems are and fix it. Spend time on it and make it right. You'll often find it's not too tough once you've got the information in front of you to spot there's the problem and that's what I need to fix. And then share that measure between all service providers. Make sure they've all got the same type of measure. Make sure it's consistent, and correlate this with your NPS. You will see NPS, Net Promoter Score, the survey responses take a big hit on tickets that bounce like crazy. Moving on, please, Neville. Happiness with devices. This is something that I'm very familiar with. I spent a lot of time doing some surveying on happiness with corporate laptops in another space. It's important because people need to be productive, right? So if you've got a laptop that takes 5 minutes to fire up, 10 minutes to shut down, using VDIs that are not performant, then this is important to get right. So in terms of that, the best practice from our perspective is before you start surveying people, get the support of the key stakeholders. There's nothing worse than getting 10,000 responses from employees about how they feel about a device, and your service owner of that specific area had no idea and didn't know you were trying to improve things. So get their buy-in that you're going to do this. Neville talked earlier about surveying and baselines, and then moving on from there, regularly surveying. From our perspective, really important to get that baseline. So survey all your employees with a very simple question: how do you feel about your company provided laptop, phone, whatever it might be? You'll get that very quickly over the space of a week or two, and then obviously correlate that information against other tools you might have in your arsenal to see, does the employee sentiment match what our management tools are telling us about the device? For example, some tools might say that this device is blue screened 10 times in the last week, or it's running in very high memory or very high CPU or very low disk space, or certain applications are tying up your machine. Very, very easy to see from some management tools. So you get that baseline, you correlate it to information that you've already got from other tools. Importantly, you then speak to people like the support teams to get their input. It's surprising how much knowledge they have, that when you ask them, they're very willing to share it with you. For example, you might hear that battery life is terrible on these machines, and that support team, no, yeah, we replace batteries all the time, right? So you can source information from these other areas. Share findings with the stakeholders. So once you've done this initial baseline, go back to the service owners and say, this is exactly how our colleagues, our employees, our colleagues feel about the devices that we're giving them. Could be positive, but equally it could be very negative, or there could be a specific device which is causing problems, a specific age of a device that's causing a problem. And then prioritize the findings and deliver on what you're being told, right? So you're being told that devices over 3 years old are really slow, with 4 gig of memory are really slow. Well, let's replace them, because I can guarantee that the price, the cost of a laptop is certainly cheaper than the cost of a person doing work that's inefficient. And then repeat. So as Neville said, look at your 10,000 employees, spread out the surveys. Probably don't survey again for a few months. Probably every quarter, every half year would be reasonable for this type of survey, to see if you've made a change and see if those changes you've put in increase the memory, removed applications which hog memory or disk or CPU, whatever, from people's devices, has improved the situation. Other tip there, real key one that we picked up on, is speak to your manufacturer, speak to the hardware manufacturer and say, why are these laptops doing this? Why is the battery bloating, or why is it only running? Why is the fan always on, for example, in specific places? And get their feedback and make sure you work with them on that, because ultimately they'll want to fix it. Otherwise they'll lose business. And a key takeaway there, obviously, people just want things to work. Sorry, I got it. Thanks, Neville. Next one, we get this asked this all the time. How do I increase my survey response rate? What is a good survey response rate? Well, simply put, the more you get, the better it will be, right? Sorry, the more you send out, the more you'll get back is obvious, right, in terms of numbers. But the percentages, we've seen upwards of 30%. It is pretty good. We've also seen organizations that have a 5% response rate. And some of the things on the left, and there's a sample on the right hand side of one that similar to one we've used before, very simple, as we'll talk through in a moment. So first off, you can encourage your support team members to inform employees when they've had a ticket resolved or something fulfilled, that they will be hearing from in this case the service desk, in terms of how they felt about that experience. So actively encourage that conversation to happen. Make sure the survey is one click. You'll see on the right hand side in that sample, just click on the number 0 to 10. That's primarily what we're interested in, how you felt. You can have other things happen behind this. So once they click on the number, it can fire up. If you've got a few more seconds, can you give us why? Was it speed, communication, whatever, empathy, whatever it might be? You can factor that into more questions and factors after that. Make sure the surveys are sent in a timely manner. So immediately after the incident is set to resolve, send off the survey, or the thing's been fulfilled, been provided to the person, send off a survey. These are the transactional things that Neville talked about earlier. Respond. If you don't respond, neither will they, right? So Neville talked about that earlier. You've got to action. You've got to take action on these responses, especially in a net promoter score situation, those 0 to 6s. You need to be looking at those detractor scores and saying, how can we turn this into a 9 or 10, right? What did we do wrong? I've actively called people, scored 0 to 6 in every response before in another organization, and it makes friends really quickly, right? They understand that you're going to be reading this feedback. They understand you're going to be taking action and making things better. Use tools. You can do this manually. That right hand side one was one that we could send out manually, no problem, through Outlook or email tools. But if you want to get greater coverage, you need to get a tool to do that for you. ITSM tools can do that. Bolt-on tools can do that. Some real great ones out there that we've worked with in the past, Neville and I. And then finally, make sure the people that are performing in this way, so getting these results, so the support agent or whatever understands what people are saying and how people are scoring their performance, right? And we've seen really good use of this in award ceremonies. So we called out the highest performers in terms of the scores that they've received in the quarter or the month or whatever. You'll see that works in specific areas and specific regions of the world really, really well, and it does motivate them to do better. Thank you, Neville. And the other question we get asked all the time is, okay, we hear this principle of XLA, we hear it all the time, but what is it? What can I do? What can I put in place, which is an example of one? So here's a few examples. But first, the big rules. Like Neville talked about earlier, think where you are now and where you want to get to. I talked about that as well. Link it to business outcomes. Consider what behavior your measurement will drive. And we hear about this all the time in SLAs, right? Where you put something in place, or a KPI, you put something in place around what someone mentioned earlier, the time on a call, and people will start cutting off calls so they hit that time. It doesn't help. It doesn't help the employee experience at all. And don't be afraid to iterate. So as you put these in place, don't be afraid to change them if you need to, right? That's what it's all about, making it better over time. So some of the outcomes on the left and some of the measures on the right. Employee happiness when something goes wrong. Sounds weird, right? But the way you handle it can turn a bad into a good. So follow up with an instant resolution survey, the one I just showed you, for example, and use NPS would be our advice. Employee happiness when they ask for something new, service request in old money, if you want to call it that. Follow up with a survey post completion of that request. Company provided device, I just talked about that. How satisfied are you with your laptop, your phone, your Office 365 stuff if you're looking at software? And then happiness with onboarding that Neville talked about earlier, that after 7 days, send a survey to the hiring manager and their employee to see how it went for them. Importantly, understand what they're sending back. Take action is the key thing from this. There's no point putting all these measures in place if you're going to take no action at all. Thank you, Neville. And finally, this is the second from last slide. Some of the things you will find when you send out lots and lots of surveys. There's lots of factors in tools that you'll get that the employer, the support agent was lovely, nice, they answered the phone quickly, whatever. But we found that over in fact, hundreds of thousands of responses, there's three main themes that you'll hear on both the positive side and the negative side. The first one is communication. So this, for me, trumps all of the other ones. I've seen instant tickets, for example, that have taken a month and a half to resolve. and the person's come back and scored 9, and you think, wow, I always thought speed was the most important thing, but frankly it's not. If you communicate well and set expectations, informing the employee how long it's going to take up front, and then start off with that. Hello, we got someone up? Okay, set up that opening conversation. My name is Mark, I'm here to help you. My contact details are these, right? Make it personal. Update, agree a cadence, and you agree how often you're going to update them, when you're next going to update them, and deliver to it. But one important thing, we saw this all the time, again, be careful what you ask for, because if you just set up you must update every 2 days, then what you'll find is that people will match that in any way possible, and if that means call them at 3 in the morning, that's what they'll do. So be very careful that you don't wake people up. It's not fun, and they don't like that very much. And then closing, when you come to close an issue off, explain what you've done in very non-technical terms. Would my mum or dad or nan and granddad understand it is important, right? Non-technical terms. And then again, like I said earlier, accept and tell that feedback will be requested, and encourage that to happen. So first thing is communication. Second thing is accuracy. There is little point, I forget the line I said to Neville the other day, there's little point doing something wrong quickly, right? So you've got to make sure you do it right first time. One thing, obviously, to do that is to automate it and get machines or whatever to do it the same way every single time, and that makes sense to do that in some cases. We've seen some good effort in there in onboarding, for example, where you take the human out of that equation and give access to tools that are needed. Tooling, right routing of tickets, making sure the ticket gets to the right place first time, avoid that bouncing we talked about earlier. Automating 3-strike processes for closure of tickets if you hear nothing back over a period of time, and making it really simple to reopen a ticket. That's very simple in some tools and not in others, and some types of record and not in others for some very valid reasons. And make sure that up front that you get the right information you need off the employee. If you need 5 bits of information, then ask for the 5 bits of information. If you don't, that's going to lead to this ping-ponging and this time delay of while you get information in different ways. Ticket closure, resolve a team, confirm the closure. The person who's resolved it, we're very, very big fans of that they seek feedback from the employee. Never close without confirmation, or that 3-strike process. If you close it, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be reopening it again or opening another ticket later on. Making sure that reopen is via one click. I talked about that earlier. Very simple process to reopen. And measure that. So measure the amount of reopen cases. You'll be surprised at how often it happens. I think it depends on how many tickets you get in your organization. But it's not fun when tickets have to get reopened. It just aggravates and isn't healthy in that relationship. And finally, the thing that everyone thinks is the most important is speed. We all want things now in our private lives, personal lives. We can get a bottle of champagne at 10 at night, 2 in the morning, whatever. We can get anything delivered to us today. And that's moved people on in their work lives to wanting the same thing. So the old SLAs, KPIs of ticket can be resolved within 6 business days just doesn't match anymore. It doesn't work anymore in my mind. So like before, making sure you get that information up front, the right information on forms, it could be a service portal form, is key. But don't make those forms overwhelming. I've seen some horrific forms with 60 things asked for, that some of it's just nice to have and not really that important in the grand scheme of things to delivering what's being asked for. Right routing, I mentioned that a moment ago, getting it to the right place first time. Bouncing ticket dashboards we just talked about, and probably automation on bouncing tickets to escalate is a real key thing for us. Automation and self-serve, password resets, access to resources. Stuck orders is another key one. If an order gets stuck, why can't systems pick up that it's stuck and do something about it, instead of a human having to raise a ticket and then getting another human to have to deal with the ticket? Then queue management. Just don't assume that this is happening. We've seen horrific ways of, an individual and an agent having 35 tickets, 100 tickets in their queue. Sometimes I've seen 500 tickets. It was the maximum I've seen in one person's queue. Forget it. That guy or gal's never going to deal with 500 tickets. So make sure that queue management is happening. Have those daily calls where we talk about tickets that are older than X. Maybe 24 hours is a good starting point, because as I say, people want things now, right? So really important that you don't just assume that's happening. One other thing I would say here, and we're all guilty of it and seeing it for years, this principle of on hold. We've seen tickets that have been put on hold, and the watermelon was talked about earlier, put on hold today. The ticket's resolved 6 months later. and it's still green because it was on hold for 5 months, 29 days and 23 hours, right? So it doesn't help the employee or the customer. Don't do it is our approach to things on that. And then the final slide, Neville, thank you, is we just thank you for listening to Neville and I today. We do appreciate your time. We've put together a simple ebook, Simple and Practical Ways to Improve Employee Happiness. There's some screen grabs on the right hand side there which go into a bit more detail about what we've talked about today. If you want a copy of it, contact us. Our details are there on the screen, and we'd love to have your feedback. Thank you.